Good afternoon. I'm Joyce Manchester with the Joint Fiscal Office, and with me is Pat Titterton.
Hi, Pat Titterton, also Joint Fiscal Office.
And Pat has the magic machine that's going to run the slideshow. But I can start talking a little bit. Our plan for this afternoon is to talk to you about how we do the modeling for the paid family leave program. And we welcome your questions along the way. We're going to be talking about the various choices that have to be made and how we've been able to fit those choices into a model that we are able to run in order to generate take up and costs and all that good stuff.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I'm just getting into the Zoom.
There we are.
There.
Is that big enough?
It is. We can, you're like in the thing rather than the
I think I'm sharing,
slideshow, I think is the word.
I'm sharing the wrong thing.
Is this under your name or take Joyce? Under your
I think
name?
it's under Joyce's.
There we go.
And the slides are under Joyce's name on our website.
Very good. Shall I go? Yeah. Okay. Why is it not moving? Okay. So first, we'll talk about some of the decisions that are involved in setting up a program of family and medical leave insurance. First, you need to ask what types of leave are you going to cover, and we'll see what types of leave are covered in H66 in just a minute. You need to ask who's eligible for benefits, how is that eligibility determined? What are the parameters in the benefit formula? So parameters is a big word for assumptions. So what are we assuming about the wage replacement rate? What are we assuming about how high the weekly benefit can go? All that sort of thing. How much do administrative services cost? And you'll see that we'll be using a placeholder because we don't really have good information about the administrative services part to date. We expect to get that information soon. And how is program revenue raised? That's a big one for this committee. Yes. Okay, so types of leave. So what's covered in H66? We have an own serious health condition, and you've been through this all with Damien, so I don't need to spend too much time on all of these things. You have the family member's serious health condition for which you are allowed to give family care. You might have a new baby or adoption or a new foster care child that would allow you to take leave. You might be helping with a military member who's going off or coming back or has been wounded or whatever. There's safe leave covering domestic violence situations and bereavement leave. So these are the types of leave that are covered now in H66. So the big question for us modelers is how many people will take each type of leave and how many weeks of leave will they take under each type? Because of course, the bill will specify that you can take up to 12 weeks of most of these types of leave, bereavement leave being the exception, only 2 weeks for bereavement leave. But many, many people will not choose to take the full 12 weeks. So what we're going to do is look at the experience in other states and specifically the experience in the state of Rhode Island, which has had a family leave policy in effect for many, many years. So they tend to have relatively high take-up rates, and that's why we're using them to give us some idea of what the take-up rate will be and how many weeks will be taken. What about benefit eligibility? So the bill says that the individual worker must have contributed to the program. I shouldn't say worker, you don't have to be currently employed, but you have to have contributed to the program in the past. You must have earned wages from which contributions were withheld in 2 of the last 4 quarters. Any amount of wages in each quarter is sufficient under H66. A big question is whether to include self-employed individuals or not. And if you include them, should they be necessarily in the program or should they have the right to opt in or opt out of the program? If they opt in, for what period of time? Of course, the problem is self-selection, right? If you know that you're going to have a baby in the following year, you might want to sign up for 1 year at a time, but that means that you could be getting quite a good return on your contributions for 1 year if you're taking 12 weeks of leave and you're only paying in for 1 year. So currently, age 66 says that if a self-employed person chooses to opt in, they will sign up for 3 years at a minimum. And after that, they may continue to opt into the program 1 year at a time. So that's how that issue has been resolved in age 66. So I've already mentioned how to re-up enrollment, and that's the decision that was made, that 1 year at a time after the first 3 years can be used as a re-up year. If you have questions as we go along, I'm happy to answer them. Okay, let's talk about some of the parameters in the benefit formula. The first big one is what's the reimbursement rate, or what percent of weekly wages would be paid out. Currently in age 66, it's 100%, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in a few minutes. The question is, what's the maximum weekly benefit? And right now it's set at the statewide average weekly wage. That is something that the Department of Labor calculates every year and publishes, so it will be known. Right now, the maximum weekly benefit is 1,000.
We had been modeling it at 1,135, which was based on Bureau of Labor Statistics information.
In 2022.
2022, right.
Yeah. So 1135, right?
Yep.
Yeah. Okay. Should there be a waiting period? In other words, after you've had the baby, should you wait a week before your benefits begin? The decision in age 66 was no waiting period, so your benefits begin immediately. The length of the various benefit leaves, again, here the decision was made 12 weeks for each type of leave except for bereavement leave, which is set at 2 weeks maximum. But you cannot string together more than 12 weeks in a 12-month period. So you can't put, family care at 12 weeks plus your own medical serious health condition at 12 weeks within the same 12-month period. Let's see, maximum number, that's 12, minimum number of leave hours taken. So in some states, they allow people to take leave for maybe 2 hours and call that family medical leave insurance. In age 66, the minimum number of leave hours taken in a block is 1 day. So it's 1 day out of a normal work week. If you work 40 hours, that's 8 hours. Intermittent versus continuous leave. Some programs would say that you can take small blocks of time many times during the year. Other programs would say once you start on paid family leave, you're on that leave until you stop and then you're back in the workforce. So we have this 1 day that is the minimum number of leave hours that can be taken, but they can be spread over many weeks. 1 day a week, perhaps, for many weeks. So once we have all of those parameters set, and once we understand who is out there in the population who is eligible to take leave, then we can use a magic model, which we'll tell you more about in just a minute, in order to generate the expected cost of benefits. Okay, so, we do have this extra slide. Parameters currently in age 66. Okay, I may have covered this already, but let's see. Types of leave covered, yes, we've talked about that. Length of leave cap, yes. Maximum weekly benefit, yes. Wage replacement rate currently 100%, and the waiting period is none. Yes.
You're ahead of your own brain. I love it.
Can be dangerous, however. Okay. Oh, yes, we haven't yet talked about administrative costs. So currently, we have a placeholder in the model that may turn out to be not quite right. When we think about administrative costs, we're thinking about two different kinds of costs. One is the one-time cost to get the program going. So as you can imagine, there's going to have to be a big investment in IT upfront in order to set up a program that can work. So we need to have some funding for those one-time costs. Once the program gets rolling, So we're taking in contributions, we're paying out benefits and so forth. Then we need to have the ongoing costs for administration, personnel, maintenance of IT, lawyer expertise and all of that in order to keep the program going. So there is this distinction between the one-time costs and the ongoing costs.
And are the ongoing costs included in sort of the model, whereas the one-time cost you would just sort of include in a fiscal note?
Yes, that's right. So the model looks at a program that's in operation. So it says, okay, you have so many people taking leave and you have so many contributions coming up. Let's say that the ongoing administrative costs would be some percentage of benefits. And we've chosen 7.5% of benefits as a placeholder for the ongoing administrative costs. We'll find out soon if that's a reasonable estimate or not. Okay, let's see. Right, so.
Did that 7.5 come from Rhode Island or something?
So there is a study that came to us from the US Department of Labor that looks at administrative costs as well as ongoing costs for existing paid family leave programs. And so from that report, we got the general sense that some states are around 5% ongoing administrative costs. Other states are closer to 7.5 or even higher, 9% maybe. So we sort of chose something in the middle, 7.5%. Okay, now also from looking at this report and from talking to folks in other states, we know that it's prudent when you start up a program to have 12 months of operating expenses plus administrative costs in the bank, so to speak. So you have that amount of funding on hand. Plus, you want to have a reserve fund on hand when you start up the program. The fear is that at the time of startup, there could be a very severe economic downturn, which would really limit your intake, right? Your contributions coming in. So, and of course, that would be the time when more people might think of taking family leave because the job situation isn't looking so good. Okay, so you want 12 months plus the reserve, which in this case is set at 9 months of benefits plus admin costs. So that says when you start up the program with benefits flowing out the door, you want to have 21 months in the bank, ready to go.
And so that, I think sometimes I think about this like I just want to clarify, because sometimes in the 21 months, it's not that you need to sort of be saving up for it for 20 months.
No.
You want money that will last you 21
Exactly.
months if like all the money,
Exactly.
other money went out the door.
And we'll see in just a minute, that's going to be about $199 million. No?
Several 150.
Oh, that's right. I had a math error. I'm remembering my math error when I should not. Right. Okay, right. So it's closer to 100. Yeah.
I think that's in the slide later.
Yeah. Okay. You want to talk about collecting?
Sure. So what's typically done in other states and what is included in H66 is to apply a payroll tax. In this instance, we have done some preliminary estimates of what that rate may be, which is applied to wages for employees. This is another thing that we're still putting out there is excuse me, a preliminary estimate. So probably still subject to change, especially as Joyce was talking about once we get some more clarity on some of the ongoing administrative costs, which the payroll tax, it's not just going to be covering benefits here, it's also covering some of those ongoing costs, well, all of those ongoing costs, excuse me. And the way it's structured in H66 right now is that the employer, I know Damien's gone over this with you, but the employer's responsible for paying at least half of it and then withholding the employee's half of it and remitting all of that to the tax department. So it's withheld like regular withholding that you see every week or 2 weeks in your paycheck. And then the one sort of quirk with self-employed people is they don't pay sort of that ongoing withholding because they're not necessarily earning like a paycheck like your average employee would. So what they typically do is pay sort of estimated taxes on a quarterly basis. And this would sort of be structured in a similar way where they'd be paying their contributions on a quarterly basis in the same way.
And it is important to note that self-employed individuals would pay the full amount of the tax. They're both the
Yes.
employer and the employee,
Right.
right? So they would pay the full amount of the tax.
Okay, so how do you get to that tax rate? So we've got two pieces of the equation here. The first being your numerator, or the top of the fraction, being the cost of providing benefits and the cost of the benefits themselves. The bottom piece is going to be whatever the wage base you decide to use is. So the tax rate is going to apply to that overall wage base to get you ideally perfectly in sync with what the program's costing you. In H66, we have in its current form wages going up to 2 times the social security maximum are subject to this payroll tax. So everything below that is, so in 2022, that figure would be 294,000. In 23, the IRS says it's going up to about 320,000. So if you're making $320,000 in income, that full amount is going to be subject to the payroll tax. Anything above that would not be subject.
320,000 in wages, right?
In
We're not
wages, right.
taxing income, we're
Right, that's
taxing
an
wages only.
important distinction. We're not talking about AGI, which is what you normally think about when you think about household income. We're directly tying this to wages earned from the employer. And, you know, you see it's going up from 22 to 23. The IRS updates that or indexes that maximum amount every year for inflation.
I'm sorry if I'm jumping ahead, but question just came up in my mind, and maybe with some mouthed things from Representative Sims. So I know that the wage base that you're calculating right now doesn't yet include self-employed people.
That's right.
But once you're able to get that data from the tax department, would that also, we would just use that same cap for self-employed people? And is that something we need to actually specify in the bill? I think it is.
I think it is specified in the bill.
Is it specified in the bill? Okay.
Yeah, and in fact, that's the cap that comes out of the Social Security Administration. It's
Right.
actually not used by the IRS. It's used for Social Security purposes, yeah. And the interesting thing about the cap for Social Security is that it is indexed to average wages in the US, which in recent years at least have been growing much faster than median wages, right? Because wages at the top are growing so much faster than wages at the bottom. So that is one consideration if you think about how that wage cap is going to grow over time. It is going to grow relatively rapidly.
Was there another question, or was it this?
Are you building out your model for when you add the self-employed people to the base
So sorry.
on gross income or net income?
Net income.
Okay.
Definitely net income, yeah.
And the way we have it set up right now is we're accounting for the self-employed costs right now, but as you mentioned, we're still waiting to get the wage information from to add that to the base. And just sort of naturally, when you think about it, if you're growing the base, ideally you're going to see that tax rate you need come down. So bigger numerator, higher rate, bigger denominator, lower rate. Just kind of a simplification. So not included in the bill as it came to your committee, but we wanted to touch on it, was an exemption for employees who are earning $25,000 or less in wages. So they would, essentially the structure had been that they would receive a refund from the tax department for their portion of their contribution. And so thinking about that, essentially what that does is you're pulling that portion of the contribution out of the wage base. So you'd be shrinking your wage base a little bit, but reimbursing these particularly low income people for their contribution. So that's not included in the bill as it came to you, but that is sort of how it started its life in House General. And so that, the way it was structured is that those people would get the refund sort of at the time of tax filing. So unlike they get it as a lump sum at the end of the year. And from the information that we do have so far, there was approximately 244,400 wage payers who were earning above that 25,000 threshold. I think overall we were about 400,000 workers. That's individual people tied together by a social security number. That doesn't mean that we have, one person with 3 jobs doesn't show up as 3 in that number. It shows up as one person. So there are a significant number of people who are earning below that threshold.
Representative Anthony, did you have a question about the 25,000?
Well, the process that you just described doesn't help the poor individual during the year because, yeah, that's the only observation I would make. I don't know if there's an easy fix to that, but you're like loaning the fund for a year.
Exactly.
So,
which is really not the intent.
Right.
yeah, and the way that the math kind of works out there is if you're someone earning $25,000 a year, your half of the contribution throughout the year is going to come out to about $70 for the year. So you are right that you're giving up some liquidity to get the refund at a later date, but it's sort of mechanically, you don't know that you're going to earn less than that amount in a year.
I understand the problem, yeah.
And I think the problem is exacerbated because people at the very low end of the income scale, earnings scale, might have several jobs, and you really need to add up earnings from all the jobs. So it does make it complicated.
Yep, understood.
And the one other thing here is that employers who would prefer to offer a private plan can opt out of this program. They just have to prove that they are offering an equivalent plan or better on the private market. So that is a situation where, if an employer decides to opt out, you're losing the wage contributions for that. But on the cost side, you're also not covering those employees. I think you're kind of removing one removing one and also removing the other. So it kind of should be netting out in that sense when you go to calculate the tax rate and what you need to raise.
The one thing that keeps me up at night is thinking about who's
Right.
likely to opt out. And if it turns out that it's the law firms with lots of very high paid workers who are more likely to opt out because they have a very generous plan already. They would have been paying relatively high contributions into the program because their earnings are quite high. And they might not be using the state provided program if they had a more generous program for themselves, right? So it's like you're taking out lots of contributions and you're not really reducing the benefits paid out by so much. So that's a possible issue. There's really no way to answer that question. How many firms would pull out and what are their characteristics until we see what happens.
Representative Beck and then Sims.
Yeah, kind of building off that a little bit. If an employer does decide to opt out, do they have to opt out all of their employees? Or could they opt out some and leave others in?
So that's a Damien question.
Yeah.
Okay, all right, well, I'll hold
I
on to it then.
would think.
That's a great Damien question.
Out all their employees because it comes to connection rules, but I'm not a lawyer.
Okay, all right.
Representative Sims and then Anthony.
Is that opt-out policy decision, or do I think I remember hearing that there were like reasons that we needed to make that opt-out available?
Well, I think there are some situations where private companies prefer to offer a more generous plan. So if they're not able to opt out, then they'd be stuck in this sort of in-between area where they have to pay into the state system, but they also want to just be more generous to their employees. And I think we've heard that that's been, in states where they don't allow that opt-out, that's been unpopular amongst employers.
Yep, Representative Anthony and then.
I thought I recall that assuming this for jurisdiction, there is a federal limitation on how you can segregate and offer the premium to some folks and the Model T to the other folks. So, but I don't know if that jurisdiction would befall our scheme here.
Right, we need Damien.
He's joining.
Yeah, Damien was watching us and now he magically appears before us.
Please stop your screen share
Oh, sure.
temporarily. Thank you.
There he is.
Damien. Hello with your sunshine and magical ears. Would you like us to repeat the question or are you aware of the entire conversation that has taken place thus far?
So give me a second here because I'm still listening to YouTube, so.
Everybody's catching up to us.
There we go.
Hi. Representative Beck had a really good question.
So Damien, when an employer decides to opt in or opt out, do they have to make that decision for all employees or some employees?
So the way the bill is structured, it requires if the employer opts out that it provides coverage to all of its employees. So the approval would be for a plan that covers all employees. You could draft the bill potentially, and I'd have to look into whether there are potential ERISA implications for this, but you could potentially draft the bill so that you can opt out for just a particular group of employees. I'm not aware of any state that does that currently, though.
Okay, thank you.
Yep.
Damien, are you aware of employers in the state that offer like one set of benefits for one class of employees, another set of benefits for another? Not that you would have to name that employer, but just.
Yeah, I think there's certainly. There are certainly
Schools do that?
instances where you would see different sets of benefits. For example, I mean, there certainly within state employees, there are different rates of vacation and sick day accrual depending on your type of position. You may see different retirement options. I don't know on the health insurance end of things or the disability insurance, but I know, for example, with like workers' compensation, your policies have to provide, the state required coverage for everyone. But certainly the cost of the policy is different depending on what the employee does. An office employee is going to have a much lower, premium than, for example, a roofer or a logger would within the same company.
Okay, thank you.
So.
Did one of the two of you have a question that was a Damien question too? Or-
I withdraw my question.
Okay.
Okay, I can come up too if that's easier for you.
No, this is fine. I think we're gonna mostly focus on the JFO team, but appreciate you popping in and out if that works for you.
Yeah,
It's
I'll
probably
just
more
stay on the
comfortable chair
call
down there.
and be present.
Okay, thanks. And we can yell for you if you want to do something else.
While we're shifting gears, question for Peter, Representative Anthony. And you're aware of a federal non-segregation policy or something?
It's ERISA, and I don't know the parameters. I just know that you couldn't cherry pick certain employees.
And the bill doesn't allow cherry picking, but it would be nice to see the policy someday if someone can find it, this background stuff.
I'm sure Joyce is familiar with it from
Well, and I think that's what
their life.
I think Damien was referencing it too.
Okay, good. Awesome.
Back to you two.
Unless
we're done.
Yeah, unless there are any other.
Is everyone clear on the tax base?
Yeah.
And how we make a rate? Okay.
Do you want to talk about the model?
Sure.
I know you've used it in the past.
Sure.
Longer than me.
Yes, so as many of you know, the family and medical leave insurance idea has been around for lots of years here in the State House. And in the past, I had a very good relationship with a guy at the Institute, I should say, a researcher at the Institute for Women's Policy Research in DC, who used to run a wonderful model for us. So I would say, okay, today we've decided to change from, 100% wage replacement to 75% wage replacement. And within a few hours, he would come back to me with new take-up rates and new benefit costs and so forth, which we would then plug in to our little spreadsheet and figure out a new tax rate. So it turns out that in 2021 maybe, the US Department of Labor created a grant opportunity for people for research firms to come together and make that model, that very same model, available publicly. So we now have a research paper and a downloadable model that we are running in-house that provides us with the very same capabilities. So it's amazing, and we are very lucky to have it. If you're familiar with the 2016 Paid Family Leave Report, it's the very same IWPR model that was used for that report. So, as I said, we are using that model that's based on census data. So it looks at Vermont's population by age and so forth to get a population base. Expected leave taking comes from Rhode Island, which has been in existence. Their program has been in existence for a long time. I noted that we are assuming ongoing admin costs of 7.5% of benefits. We're waiting for specific startup costs so that we can add those into the model as well. And at some point, we will do a much more detailed look at the monthly cash flow. Because what happens in the bill is that we have to set up a special fund for the paid family leave program. That special fund needs to be adequately funded each month so that as benefit payouts go out the door, there's never a deficit in the fund. If there were a deficit, the treasurer would have to back it up, right? And they don't want to be in that position to have to back up specific programs. So once we get a very detailed picture of the startup costs and how those are going to work, and once we know the initial transfer from the general fund to the special fund, then we'll be able to figure out what does the monthly flow look like, and are there specific periods of the year in which the fund might go negative or be close to going negative.
Representative Taylor?
Is the expected leave from Rhode Island part of the model or after the model?
It's part of the model.
Do they have any qualifiers for it? Because, I mean, Rhode Island is a tightly packed certain industries. Vermont is rural, different industries. Are there?
Yeah, the one thing I can say is that Rhode Island was chosen because it has relatively high take-up rates compared to other states that have an ongoing program. So if we were to use any other state as our model state, we'd be seeing lower take-up rates, which would mean we might be underestimating costs. Do you think the density has something to do with the take-up rate?
That's what I'm wondering.
Well, I mean.
We had testimony earlier today that sort of led us to believe that.
Oh, is that right? Interesting.
And the different types of industries might,
Yeah, that's certainly true. It is true that in the bill, there's an annual report back to the legislature that would say, here's what we're looking at based on experience. This is what we see. Are we adequately funding the program? Do we see that people are taking more or fewer leaves than expected? So there would be that chance for a check back. And there are states like California where their complaint is that take-up is too low, actually, compared to the expected rates. And California has just increased its wage replacement rate up to 90%. It had been down closer to 65%, I believe.
Okay.
So, there are various levers that you can move.
Once you get it going.
Right, once you see
Yeah.
what's actually happening.
Yeah. Okay.
If we have that large reserve that we talked about a couple slides ago, do you really anticipate sort of a month-to-month cash flow problem?
Right, so the question is, do you want to dip into the reserve for month-to-month cash flow issues, right? Or do you want to leave that reserve for when the economy really tanks?
Representative?
Thank you. This is probably from a slide ago, but do you have access to how many businesses of which size producing with how many employees you're counting on when you put the model together? Because, and which ones of them already have leave?
No, we don't have such detailed data on businesses. We're assuming in our current estimate that all workers would contribute and that all workers would be eligible to take leave. But the idea is that if some businesses opt out, their people would not be taking leave, right? So there would be a proportional change in both the benefits taken and the contributions coming in.
Try to think of that.
And one thing, I mean, it's not directly getting at your question, but one thing that is available through the census survey data that's available in the simulator is that it does show classification of employees. So we know if, the employee within the sample is a state employee, municipal, private employed, self-employed. So we are able to break it down that way, but not by like size of establishment.
Or industry.
Or industry, right?
Are the state employees going to be part of this? And teachers?
So the understanding is that because this program is more generous than the governor's program that's on the table, that they would join this program because their employer can't show that they have a program that's equivalent or better.
Till they renegotiate.
They might renegotiate, they might, yeah.
But we wouldn't interfere in that collective bargaining
No.
process.
I thought there was data from Vermont labor by SIC code, at least down to 2 digits or thereabouts, no?
But is that tied to the type of leave program?
No, but it would be,
Right,
is it manufacturing, is it?
Right,
Okay,
right. And we know that many businesses in Vermont are very small.
yeah,
right?
okay.
Very few of them are.
That would be the other comparable that I would worry about compared to
Right.
Rhode Island. But
Right.
But it sounds like you're choosing parameters that are sort of safe. I don't want to call them overestimates, but safe estimates.
Conservative.
Because
We're striving
Thank you.
to be conservative.
Yes. Yes. Okay, all right, we're gone. Yes, go.
So the model that we've been talking about lets us simulate estimated costs for everything except safe and bereavement leave. So everything you'll see here is coming from that model with some back-end adjustments we had to make. We've kind of squished some categories in here together, like you'll see family care is where military exigency lives in terms of leave number and cost. So, but this is broadly speaking our estimated number of leaves by leave type, and then the associated cost with that particular type of leave. So you can see under the current parameters that we're talking about, average weekly benefits will come out to a little under $550 per week. So remember the max was at $1,135, right? And then the overall cost of just the benefits, of the cost of the benefits, is that $79.5 million figure you see there. So when we apply that sort of placeholder 7.5% ongoing administrative cost assumption to it, we're coming out to about $6 million. There is a slight mismatch in the bill as it came to you versus what the tax rate is saying. The last committee took out this $25,000 exemption, which we had talked about, right? And that 0.55 rate had applied to that wage base. So given the current rate and the slightly expanded wage base, we'd actually be estimating that $91.5 million would come in, as opposed to what we're estimating the cost to be. So if we were to change that rate to match this cost with this wage base, it'd be more in the 0.52 range if we're just trying to match it up exactly. But, again, that's based on these assumptions about ongoing costs. So, as things evolve, we'll be able to hone in on that a little bit more clearly.
Go ahead.
Given that the plan is that we're gonna give the people under 25K a year back their money, is that really something that we wanna factor in?
So the bill as it came over to you from House General does not have that exemption.
Okay,
But if it did, then you would want to factor it in because their half of the contribution that they're making would then have to come back out to refund them
that
for
makes
the
sense.
amount.
Okay, thank you.
For you, yes, go ahead.
And you're still gonna hone in on the military piece?
So we have that incorporated here. We've done a little bit. So it's baked into the family care line item there. Overall, we expect that type of leave to be relatively de minimis in terms of cost, but it's sort of baked in there.
Okay.
Just curious to know how you came up with the numbers on the number of leaves taken, and I just want to say I'm sort of horrified to see the number of safe leaves there. That's
Yeah.
really, I didn't think that number would be anywhere near that high.
Did you know that the majority of police actions in Vermont, police calls is domestic violence?
Yeah.
It's like the majority of crime in the state.
And over and over, same
Anyway,
place.
sorry.
I know that from my time on corrections and institutions, but I still found that number just I find it horrifying.
Majority or what?
I'm sorry,
Fine.
go ahead.
So that's a great question. So this is an example of one of the types of leave we had to come up with a estimation for outside of the model because it wasn't a type that was supported by that model. And so what we did, there's actually a report that was done, I think it's a feasibility study, it's a type of report for the state of, and they had to do a similar type of estimate. So we stole, borrowed, whatever you want to call it, some of their methodology for it. And they were relying on national survey data for the most part to come up with it. And that accounted for percent of population that experiences domestic violence, the percent that are expected to miss at least a day of work, the amount that are, likely to actually take advantage of a leave program if it's available to them. So there's several steps along the way where you're winnowing down the number of people. But even at the very end of all that, it's a crime that's still wildly underreported. So I think I would agree with you in thinking that it may be a little bit high, but if this is available to all of these people who are experiencing this kind of type of violence, it could, what's the word? Not promote, but incentivize them to actually, engage with this type of program if it's available to them.
And all the more reason for the bill too.
Sort of the opposite side of that, just pausing to feel those things. The family care number seems on the very low side. Could you talk a little bit about that number?
Well, that is one of the ones that is based on the observed data collected from Rhode Island. We see that it's much more likely, based on their experience, that people are taking leave for their own health problems. And I think that, I don't know if you have anything to add to that, but, it's really, that's based on the, observed data that we have available to us.
I'm sort of thinking about our demographic here in Vermont,
Right.
older and aging.
Yeah, there aren't that many babies born in Vermont here.
Okay, so I had the same issue, and I had to be enlightened on this topic. So there are two parents for many babies, and both parents can take leave. Yes, so it is true that the number of babies born in Vermont last year was 5,200, 5,100, something like this. So this is actually a larger number than number of babies born, but two parents.
Not always, but sometimes, yeah.
Exactly.
Representative Beck, Representative Taylor, and then you're good, okay.
It looks to me like the benefit cost that they've been weighted by the number of days that the average person in that category takes, which I think is really interesting. I would just, if you come back, I would really be curious to know, like, what is the average number of days taken for each of those categories? And it looks like safe leave and bereavement are very short periods of time, and some of the other ones are much longer periods of time.
So the only one I can tell you off the top of my head, because I remember that one exactly, is we're using, and this is again based on the survey data, we're using an assumed 1.7 weeks for safe leave.
Okay.
So that comes out to like a week and a half. What is that?
8 days or something.
Eight or 9, yeah, 8 days, somewhere in that range.
Okay. It's kind of interesting that I think they're very different durations for each of those categories. Just looking at the way the numbers are working.
Definitely, yeah.
Representative Taylor?
Is the Rhode Island system similar to Vermont in that it's administered by the state government?
Yes.
And people would, the state government has to just receives applications for the leave and they have to process it? Okay.
Yes.
Good, thank you.
Actually, Rhode Island is one of the 4 early states that built paid family leave programs on top of their temporary disability insurance programs. So they had a statewide TDI, as it's called, temporary disability insurance program, and they sort of built the paid family leave around that program. And the states that have come on since then, DC being the first, have had to start up the programs from scratch, essentially, because they didn't have a TDI program. So the early evidence we had on startup costs and so forth wasn't quite applicable to Vermont's situation because they were building off this existing system already.
And then we sort of talked about the percentage changes that might happen based on what we would do with the $25,000 exemption. I feel so impatient about the self-employment data, and I'm like trying to be disciplined, not asking about it too much because I know you don't have it, but do you have like any sense of scale at all about what we might be talking about in terms of percentage changes? Or do we just have to be very patient?
I don't want to go there.
Okay. I can respect that. I will continue with my lack of patience while you have discipline. Thank you.
Are we good?
Going? Yes. Considerations. Yes. Shall I start?
Sure.
So currently the wage replacement rate is 100%. And one thing to think about is that income taxes would still be levied against the paid family leave benefit. So both federal and state income taxes would still come out of that benefit. However, the existing federal payroll taxes, which are for Social Security and Medicare, are levied only on wages, earned income. So they would not come out of the benefit that would be paid from the paid family leave program. So that means if someone is really a calculating sort of person, they would figure out that their take-home pay on paid family leave would be slightly higher than if they continue to work, right? Because they would not be paying out 6.2% for their share of Social Security or 1.45% for their share of Medicare.
And I don't think that was the intent with the bill. And so I'm trying to do the math, but what would the percentage?
So it's 7.65%.
Okay.
Employees share together.
So like 90-92 would.
0.35, yeah.
Okay. Right. And for the self-employed, they would be paying both halves of Social Security and Medicare. So they would be paying a total of 15.3%. So I don't know how fine-tuned you want to make this calculation, but yeah, it is maybe a consideration. I would also note, that the reserve fund is currently set at 9 months of benefits and administrative costs. Many states use 6 months as their reserve. So that's another question for you all.
Which states use 6 months as the reserve?
Well, I just happen to have my handy dandy table. We have a table put together in October of 2022. So let's see, reserve. I need to find the reserve page. not on
I
this
don't know
table?
if it's on,
Aye,
yeah.
aye, aye. It may be in the, I didn't even bring the, oh, yes, I did.
It's okay.
Okay, we may have to get back to you. It's somewhere in this paper, I believe. But we can figure that out.
More than one state, though.
Do you know if those states that have a 6-month reserve, did they create that 6 month when they stood their program up, or did they have something larger and then pare back?
We would have to check, but most of the programs are relatively new in the last 5 years or so. So it won't be hard to figure out when they decided their reserve fund.
And I wonder if Damien would know the answer to that question. Do you think he would?
You may.
Damien once had
It
a
worked. There he goes.
very large spreadsheet that kept track of all these.
Can you repeat the question?
Indeed. The question was, the states that had a 6-month reserve rather than the 9-month reserve that's in H66, do you know if they started with a 6-month reserve or if and then kept it, or if they started with a larger reserve and then pared it back?
I would have to look. I don't know that off the top of my head. It never made it onto my giant spreadsheet.
Okay.
But I can find out for you by next week.
Okay, whoever wants to do the research, thank you. I appreciate
Yeah, I'll
that.
coordinate with Joyce and Patrick.
Okay, thanks. Farewell.
Next time.
The next point is one that we've already covered. So the self-employed are currently counted in taking leaves because they're part of the overall population, but their contributions based on self-employed net income are not yet included. The problem is that currently the tax department does not follow the self-employed net income carefully, and so they just don't have the statistics at their fingertips. They're working on it. Okay. We currently see that funds needed when the benefits begin to go out the door are underfunded. So the current setup is that payroll tax contributions would come in for 15 months, at which point the benefits would then become available. So contributions for 15 months produces about $114 million if the rate is 0.55%.
Yeah, with that caveat.
Right. That rate is going to change, we know.
Just quickly, if it was matched up to the 85.5 million, it would be more like $106 million over 15 months.
Okay. And then when benefits begin, because you want to have 12 months worth of benefits and admin costs plus 9 months, you would need plus the reserve, 150 million, right? This is the number I have to remember rather than
Not
the
199.
wrong number, right? Yes. Yes, so you can see that we're short in terms of putting money in the bank before the program.
And so our choices could be to extend the period, to increase the rate, or to put more one-time money in to jumpstart the fund. Or is there like a fourth lever that I didn't name in my little list there?
Theoretically, you could keep the rate the same and reduce the benefits.
That's true. Thank you.
Okay.
And that is accounting for a 6-month reserve or a 9-month reserve?
That's a 9-month.
Okay, so,
9-month. Right.
and so if we brought it to the 6-month reserve, then it's the 10.
A quarter.
That's yeah. Sorry.
It would be a quarter of 91.
Yeah, roughly
Is
3
21?
months roughly equates to about $21 million. So that 106 we talked about is 15 months. You're looking to get to 18 months, add roughly 21 million to that.
No,
Weren't we taking 6 months away?
That's
you're going from a 9-month reserve to a 6-month. reserve.
Taking 3 months away, thank you.
3 months away.
Okay, so we would go from needing,
Instead of 35 million, you need, what's 35? 14 million, right? We take away 21 million.
will you say the number again? That we would need if we went
So
to
it's
6 months?
150 minus 21, right?
Right, but we have 114. So instead of needing 36 million, we would need 15 million, right?
Thank you.
It's hard to do math on the fly.
It is, that's why I'm asking you to do it instead of trying to do it myself on my own. Thanks for doing it. Okay.
Okay, now we come to further considerations, and this gets to be a little bit involved, so we'll do our best. So we know that the transfer from the general fund to the special fund, which would happen July 1st, 2023.
Which is just like an appropriation.
It's an appropriation, it's a transfer, you just move money from the general fund to the special fund to fund the initial startup phase. So remember, a lot of that is IT, some of it is personnel to write the rules and to set up all the procedures and so forth. So right now that transfer is set at $20 million. We know that IT alone is likely to exceed $20 million. We have the report from the Department of Labor, US Department of Labor, showing what other states have paid for IT, and it can get to be a little bit scary. For example, Washington State spent $82 million on their IT. I have it from the director of the DC Paid Family Leave Program that the program in Washington is running fantastically. They love it. You know, it does everything they wanted and more. Washington State. Yeah, I talked to the director in DC. Talks to all the directors of all the programs. And everybody is in awe of the Washington State program. But they spent $82 million to get it. In Colorado, they're quite pleased with their program. They spent $47 million. And interesting is the case of Connecticut, where they use a third-party administrator. So that is an option that was explored, 3 or 4 years ago, when the Department of Labor was unable to set up the program. The state of Vermont was going to engage a third party to submit a bid and then run paid family leave in Vermont. So Connecticut seems quite happy with their third-party administrator.
Representative Taylor and then Representative Beck.
Those 82 and 47 are current dollars? How
No.
old?
2016 was, so Washington State actually did their work in 2019, maybe.
Okay.
And Colorado is even more recent. Yeah.
And tomorrow, the treasurer is going to come in for a presentation with what they estimate the cost to be for startup on their end. And then we heard sort of preliminary estimates from Craig this morning.
As far as software startup costs, does it correlate to the population of the state, or is it just a build is costs as much in Vermont as it would cost in Texas? Do you want the same product? Is that how it works?
It's more like the same product than it is tied to the population. Because you need all the capabilities.
Makes sense.
Regardless of your population. Yeah, and I keep thinking that we should be able to build off an existing system in some other state. But because every state is so different in terms of the way that they collect revenue and the way that they pay out benefits.
They don't want to give it away just.
Well, and in fact, back in history, like in the late teens, Vermont was part of a consortium with 2 other states to try to develop a single product for software to do
DOL.
thing. DOL was very much involved, and it just fell apart because every state is different. It didn't work. Yes, and also, so on top of the IT costs, which could be many millions of dollars, we also know that we would have to fund multiple new positions, both in the Division of Family and Medical Leave, which is part of the Treasurer's Office, but also in the Department of Taxes. So it looks like there will be larger startup costs than is currently provided in the bill. Okay, we're all going to take a breath and rest our minds, and then we're going to go to the next problem, which is that the transfer from the general fund is currently designated as an advance payment of what the state of Vermont would pay as an employer of employees, right, in their contributions. So the thinking was that if you took $20 million from the general fund, that the state, as an employer of all us state employees, would not have to make its employer contributions for many years until those employer contributions added up to be $20 million. Okay, so it's like an advance payment of future contributions. Well, unfortunately, it's more complicated than that, as you might expect. So I do know that if the program were in place today at a 0.55% rate, the state would be paying about $1.9 million in the employer share of contributions for its employees, okay? So that tells me that it would take about 10 years to build up the would-be contributions to be equivalent to the $20 million paid up front, okay? So that's 10 years of contributions that won't be made. Unfortunately, only about 40% of employee costs for state employees comes out of the general fund. The rest come from special funds like the transportation fund. I think that's the easiest one to think about. The transportation fund has its own sources of funding. And the transportation fund pays all the employee costs of transportation employees, except those that are funded by the federal government. And there are many employees who work within state government who are actually funded by federal grants or federal sources of revenue. So for example, the economist at the Department of Labor has funding that comes from the federal government. It's sort of considered part of the UI trust fund that money comes back from the feds to pay for that salary. So if the general fund transfers all of that $20 million over to the special fund, and we think that that is standing in for future contributions by the state as an employer, it really means that the general fund should only be paying $8 million, right? 40% of the $20 million. That would be their actual payment, their share. And we are not then asking the transportation fund or the federal funds to pay for the employer's share. We're essentially leaving money on the table, right? We're not getting the revenue that we should be from those other funds. So it doesn't quite make sense to say that the general fund transfer should be linked to that advance payment of employer.
So before I ask Damien to sort of help me remember the history of how we wound up with this language in here, I guess I just want to ask, couldn't we just have an easy solution of getting rid of all of this sort of complicated mechanisms and language, just do a regular appropriation of one-time money from the general fund and then have the state pay for its employees the way it would any other employer would pay for its employees?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely.
That would solve all this
You will see
complicated.
the last bullet there says simpler to designate one-time money for startup costs with no advance payment.
Okay.
Exactly.
Okay, and then Damien?
Sure. So this provision came, what's that?
Can I ask you a question before you explain?
Yeah.
So can I just tell you my theory and you can tell me if it's right? Is that okay? So last time we did this, or like the second to last time we did this, anyway, the time it almost passed or did pass and then got vetoed that time, 2 biennium ago. One, we had a different collective bargaining agreement in place. And 2, we didn't have a lot of one-time money floating around in the budget to use. And so we created this complicated mechanism that we then carried forward into this bill. No, darn it. Tell me the history. I know, I loved it. I created such a conspiracy. What is it?
So the last time actually the mechanism was not complicated, but it was, well, I'm not going to come up with a name for it, but basically it required us to deficit spend until money started coming in. So it basically said the state will spend in anticipation of receipts. So it was unappropriated money that was being spent in anticipation of receipts. This time, to get around that, we had seen that Colorado did this prepayment. They had put $47 million in and prepaid the state employees' contributions that way. And basically they did it as a loan from their general fund, where the loan was paid off at a 1% interest rate against state employee contributions for however many years, 10 or 15 years. And so that's why this was in the bill. I don't know if they've had to go back and make tweaks now, because I assume they're in the same position that Joyce just described, where they have all sorts of different funding streams and funds set up, and it's not just general fund dollars. And there's no reason you can't do a one-time appropriation. That would make perfect sense. We just haven't done it in the past for the reason you stated, which is that there hasn't been a lot of one-time money lying around.
Carol? Oh, thank you. I was just thinking, if we were to use one-time money, I would think about having the system pay back that one-time money. Because there's so many needs, and it would be, awesome, basically, to get this started and have it be a secure footing, and then be able to use that payback for another thing.
Well, we can leave that part to the appropriations committee. We can simplify it as much as possible, and if they decide they want to recoup costs somehow, they can put that in.
Oh, that's true. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you, Damien.
Welcome.
You may go back to ignoring us for a period.
Okay.
I think we have one slide left.
Okay.
Thank you.
Oh, well, let's show them the thank you. Oh, I guess we're done.
You're welcome. Thank you. You appreciate the slide now. Thank you for that.
Are we good? No more questions?
Yeah, I think next steps is sort of helpful to say aloud altogether. We're waiting on a bunch of numbers. I think we're going to get them in the next couple days. And then when we have them, you'll come back to us with a fiscal note?
Yeah.
Yes.
That sound good?
Sure.
Okay, cool.
Can I actually?
Yeah.
When you get the numbers for self-employed people, do you get any data about what the average self-employed person makes annually?
Well, we should get it as, we should get the number of Social Security numbers they're talking about. And then we should get the total the total wage amount, or whatever we're calling it. And you could get the average through just dividing.
Yeah, I would, if it's not like a onerous process, I would be really interested in that.
I think what we won't know is how many of those self-employed people also have an employment position, right? So they're employed by an employer. So how does that work?
Well, tax should be able to tie them to their Social Security number.
So they may have to give us two numbers. They may have to give us the total number of self-employed and solely self-employed, right?
Yeah.
I was going to say, I suspect, and this is anecdotal, that many partnerships will have mix and match between a person being a sole proprietor and the partner having a day job in a W-2 form.
Right. Right.
You mean family kind of partnerships or business partnerships?
Yeah, sole proprietors, husband and wife can file as a sole proprietor. It's a family partnership.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, thank you very much. You have research. We have research to make. Appreciate it.
Good. Thank you.
Thanks.
Yes, to be continued.
Indeed. 2:30, we are going to the floor at 3. Everyone has 30 minutes in their day to do something productive with. I think a bunch of people in committee are tracking bills that are about to come to us from other committees. Please do that. And then we're coming back after the floor for H67 and hoping that we can tie a bow on that one by the end of the day.